Welcome back, everyone, to the Risk Intel podcast, powered by SRA Watchtower, where we share risk intelligence with experts from across the banking industry. I'm your host, Ed Vinson, CEO at SRA Watchtower. Hello, welcome back to the Risk Intel podcast. I am very excited to have back on the program with me today, Jeff Fink, the founder and CEO of Lumio Insight. Jeff, thanks for joining us again.
Thank you, Ed. I appreciate it. Good to be back.
Jeff, in our last couple of conversations, we talked about data governance and data architecture, and you were really helping us get a view into this modern data platform, right? Which you've constructed there at Lumio Insight, and really the importance of data as the currency of the future for these community banks and credit unions that operate in the space that we both know so well. I want to pick up on those couple of themes and drill into the last topic of our series here and talk a bit about risk management and data risk management and the concepts as to how you protect your data, how you make sure that it's secure, and understanding really this balance between right being really protective of it, but also using it to drive business decisions. So let's start on this topic by talking about the main risks that banks really face with their data, and then continue on to talk about how they mitigate those risks through some of those themes we talked about before around architecture and governance. So what are the main risks that you think about when it comes to data inside a financial institution?
Yeah. Well, first, I would say it's the things that we hear in the news all the time now, and it just unfortunately feels like it's every week or potentially even every day sometimes. But those data breaches, I think that's the first thing I think of. Across almost all industries now, and this is potentially millions of records of data, being exposed, being sold on the dark web, and those things that we again hear in the news. That's a big one. And then I think just in general, also I would say cyber attacks. So thinking about things like ransomware, phishing, bad actors looking, to get into your organization, to steal data. And then I guess just another classification there would be just unauthorized access. When we think about, what's valuable in data, one of the main categories that I think of is that personally identifiable data information. So
Right.
PII, customer information, of course. Um, and that unauthorized access can of course be external to the institution, but even internally as well. Making sure, again, when we're talking about the risk side, the risk of even internal employees accessing data that they shouldn't, that they don't need access to, and potentially, looking to steal data like that or use it for malicious purposes. So those to me are the big risks. And then when I think about mitigation, how do we make sure, these things aren't happening within an institution? First thing I think about is encryption. So, data that's being stored. So, what we call data at rest, and then data that's being moved, we call that, data in transit. So thinking about encrypting that data regardless of where it is, or again, whether it's at rest or in transit. That's a really good way to, again, just a base, a starting point for
Right.
preventing unauthorized access. And then I would layer on top of that access control, extremely important. Thinking about things like role-based access, and can call, or a finer level of granularity to that would be least privilege access, meaning let's not give everyone access, to things that they just really don't need. So really thinking about, the authorizations and the access that we give. And then when we're going to give someone access to data, using things like making sure, they are who they say they are. And so that's the authentication piece. And a common tool there that's very effective, and that's multi-factor authentication. A way to make sure, that we're giving access to someone that deserves that access, and using that, a secondary authentication method, like sending a text to their phone, or more popular now is an authenticator app on a mobile device,
Right.
just to make sure they are who they are. And then I guess I'd also add, a zero trust architecture is definitely a best practice, meaning give no one access to anything, and then making sure when we do give access, whether it's inside or outside the organization, that it's someone that's verified and authenticated before actually granting that access. I think that's an important one. And then regular security audits, come to mind again, thinking about, how do we identify, any gaps, in our controls. Having those regular audits is definitely a plus. And then thinking about, our vendors, any vendors of the institution. SOC 2 compliance is a big one there, and really a must, in today's world. So making sure that those vendors, other fintechs, are going through those compliance exams, and
Right.
that they have, proper policies and procedures around protecting data, among other things. There's a lot of other things involved in things like SOC 2 compliance, but of course, data security, information security being a big one there. Those are the things I think about.
Jeff, you talked about a few different areas there, in terms of the risks, right? The data breaches, cyber attacks, unauthorized access, and then I'll come back to those mitigation factors at the end to perhaps recap those.
Yeah.
But you know the cyber attacks area and cybersecurity is certainly is an incredibly hot topic these days, right? There are lots of organizations that have tools and programs and processes to protect and then also to remediate after the
Yeah.
fact. So, what are the things? And I think you incorporated some of those into your mitigation strategies, but
Yeah.
how should banks be securing their sensitive data, and to minimize risk in the first place? Should they be storing it in certain places or ways that minimize the chance that someone's even gonna get their hands on it in the first place?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And as you mentioned, Ed, the mitigation steps that we just discussed, I think that's the starting point. But then there's other layers here, and these are now, some of these are newer services or newer technologies that are helping in battling cybersecurity, or making sure we can secure that sensitive data. So things like, a new managed service that I think is important is called threat detection monitoring. And so what that does on physical devices like laptops, mobile devices, um, it's actually a service that is monitoring for threats. And of course, those services are being updated with what are the current threats, on a constant basis, a daily basis. So they're monitoring the devices for those threats. And then another popular way, another method there is that threat detection through email accounts, because we all know that millions and millions of emails are
Yeah,
sent, every day, or probably every minute or second, and those are important to an organization, and all the employees are opening up emails all the time. So actually monitoring threats, in the email accounts, even before those messages reach the end user, those threats can be, hopefully found ahead of time,
yeah,
and isolated and secured, so that they don't even reach the end user. So I think, to me, that's the prevention. I think that's a big one. Then I think another category that I think is important, vulnerability scanning, and then things like penetration testing. So the scanning is thinking about all of the cloud resources that would be part of a data platform, a modern data platform. We might talk more about that here as we go, but thinking about scanning those resources for vulnerabilities constantly, and again, more of a prevention, and then doing things like penetration testing. Let's actually see if we can poke into a network or into a data device that or a device that's storing data that to see and make sure that those holes don't exist. So I think those are things that are important. And then lastly, I would mention, just regular training and awareness programs. That I think a popular one that we use all the time is simulating phishing exercises.
Right.
So sending emails to all of our employees in different forms and fashions that represent, essentially fake or simulated, phishing attempts, and seeing what happens. So again, it's a way to test and of hope, as if those are accessed and we don't want to see that, but if we do, then it actually flags that as a learning opportunity. There's then links to training sessions, and really thinking about beefing up that training. So it's a multi-prong, approach, just like you would think, and there's a lot of different things to just continue and be vigilant. That's how we approach it, and those are the main things I think about it.
Jeff, let's come back to one thing you mentioned in the middle there. And yes, I mean a lot of those themes. I mean, I think about right, the simulated phishing and right, we have training modules that we watch on a scheduled basis. But then if something like that does get through, um, you have a set of supplemental curriculum, right, that you can get your eyes on.
Yeah.
I want to come back to this concept of the vulnerability scanning, and you mentioned right with the modern data platform, this is an area that I imagine is near and dear to your heart to really make sure that your platform is secure there. So perhaps unpack that a little bit, if you will, in the context of that of the of the Lumia modern data platform. How do you approach vulnerability scanning? Because you have a number of different points along that platform where there are right there is risk.
Yeah, we use an external vendor, that essentially a cloud-based security provider, that they are experts in vulnerability scanning, and they have tools that we license, and they run all the time. So we have them 24/7, running, doing those scans, and we get notifications hourly, that tell us, or notifies that there is something that we need to look at. But we know those scans are happening in real time, and then we're taking a look at that. They do produce, daily, weekly, monthly reports as well, that we make sure that we take a look at, look to rectify anything that it's found. But most of the time it's more about, it's seeing some warnings, and then we're able to take a look at those before anything happens. So I think it is, leveraging, well, the way I look at it is there's just no one way to ensure that data is protected 100%. It really is a multi-prong approach, as I've said. And so we're looking at all different tools and technologies to do that, and leveraging a provider that does specialize in cloud-based security and vulnerability scanning. I think is definitely a helpful tool to have.
Jeff, there are two thoughts that your comments there trigger.
Mhm.
The first is that that multi-layered approach is really I'd say a fundamental tenet to enterprise risk management, right? We think of three lines of defense, right? The
Yeah,
first line there in the business, the second line there with the risk team, and the third line at the board or the audit level. And it seems like that's a pretty good parallel here to the way that you're thinking about, threat prevention and threat detection, threat remediation, right? Is that it's not just one and done. You need to have these multiple layers, right?
no question. Yeah, no, I
Um,
definitely agree with that.
the other thought is that as you're talking about um, the way that you've incorporated a number of these components into your modern data platform, it strikes me that you do this once and then you're able to then extend that value out to multiple different financial institutions that you work with. That's a different value proposition than if someone is trying to do this in-house, because
Yeah,
you could take a shortcut and try and build a a warehouse, a data mart, right,
yeah,
a semantic layer, all those pieces.
right.
But then if you don't have these layers in place, you are at significant risk. And so someone that someone who's going to build it just for themselves is going to have all these layers that right a solution like Lumio Insight offers, and you're able to scale that out across an entire client base. So that's just a really interesting way of thinking about doing it one off versus doing it once and federating it out essentially.
Yeah, really think of, we've been going through years of hardening of the environments, that we create where we store, Lumio data. And you're right, not every institution, has teams to do that and can, wait years to get, something that's going to be secure. So you're right, leveraging, platforms, as we said, the modern data platform, I think is a way to, to really get a more robust, security environment for your data than it is to try to build something out for yourself, from scratch. I know we think back to the model where, it used to be, well, if I have control of my own servers in my own data center, then I do have more control, and that's going to be more safe. And that model has just flipped, on its side now,
Yeah.
that is not the most secure way to do things now, that to leverage, these larger cloud platforms that do have, again, this hardened environment that they've been working on for years, and spend, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, to keep up this technology and to do this vulnerability scanning, every second. To me, that's just, it is a different environment now. And it really, is leveraging, the best of the really best practices in all of the different areas. And trying to do all of that on your own is just a very tall order that's really hard to do these days. So,
Let me bring it back then to
sure.
our theme here of, this is hard to do. There's a lot that you need to do to be ahead of issues, to mitigate risks, right? From encryption to, access control and authentication and zero trust architecture and security audits and vendor management, right? You went through a whole litany there. When I hear that, right, one reaction is to say, all right, stop. Right, we're not gonna go down this path, and that itself has its own, perils associated with it. How do you think about striking a balance between meeting these, you know, these governance and architecture and risk management constraints or parameters, while also still making data accessible for strategic use inside an institution?
Yeah, yeah, you said key terms there, striking a balance.
Mm,
I believe, data is one of the most strategic assets an institution has. And you're right, we've got to leverage, we still want to use that data, but how do we strike that balance of making sure that it's secure? In our last episode, we spoke about, data governance programs, standards and policies of how we treat our data, how we classify our data, how we make sure that it's staying secure. And then today, we've talked a little bit about modern data platforms and taking advantage of those, best practices with cloud technologies. There's other things too that I think about, like, just our approach on how we collect and store data. Um, there's two different schools of thought here. One, and I think to me, this is an older school of thought, and that's that I call it supply side data collection or data warehousing, meaning we're just going to take everything we think could be used at some point by some user, and we're just going to warehouse it. We're going to store it, we're going to archive it, we're going to make sure it's available so that I have it if I need it in the future. And that used to be a good approach. And obviously you can think of, pros and cons to that approach. But I believe, more of a best practices approach, I call it demand driven data collection and storage. So meaning, there is a specific need for this information, and that means that we should store it and we should protect it, and we don't have all of these data elements, these hundreds of data elements
Mm.
in the supply side collection model that are just sitting there and potentially at risk for a data breach. So again, that's the balance of making sure that we recognize that we do need to to leverage data because it's so strategic to our organization, but let's also make sure that we're just not, leaving data, in an environment that could be compromised when we don't even need that access to that data. So we've already mentioned, that personally identifiable data, so PII. Um, of course, a strategy there. Again, this is how you kind of walk that fine line, and that's if we're going to need some access to PII, most likely, in most cases, we found you can mask that PII data. So that you're still storing something that represents, whether it's a partial customer number or what we would call a proxy for a customer number or an account number, meaning it's not the real account number and customer number, but it's something that represents a unique number. And of course, for those users that really do need those, access to those real numbers, maybe that's just in the operational systems and not in the reporting and analytics system. So that data masking is a tool that we use. And then last thing I would say is thinking about, part of a data governance program is data retention policies, and flip that the other way, data purging policy. So
Right.
how long are we going to retain this data? And it really can be different for every data element, just depending on what its use is and its value, and making sure that we're thinking about that. And it's part of our program, our data governance program or policies. So one example of that is that I may need to aggregate data, or sorry, this is a strategy that I could aggregate very detailed transaction data, for example, and I would store those aggregates, meaning by
Right.
customer, I want to see the number of transactions they had in a given month. But over time, most likely, I don't need to know what was the very
The- Yeah.
detail of a deposit transaction on the 13th of the month, from
Yeah.
3 years ago. I don't need that detailed piece of information. So let's not store
Right.
that, but let's aggregate this up so that I still get the value from that data, and I'm not storing some of those things that I don't need.
I love that example there, Jeff. Thank you. You took the theoretical or the academic or the conceptual, and you really put a point on it there with that example. And I think that brings it home to to highlight the fact that there are techniques, there are approaches here where you can mitigate the risks. You can still head down this path, and make data available for strategic use, without you know, creating undue exposure and risk for an organization. Jeff, we've covered a lot of ground here. This has been incredibly helpful. I mean, I think that from beginning with architecture and governance, and now talking about risk management here today, um, right? You talked about a handful of the risks around data breaches and cyber attacks and unauthorized access, and then the mitigation strategies from encryption to access control and authentication and zero trust architecture, security audits, vendor management, and then the prevention tools and techniques around threat detection, monitoring, and detections via email and vulnerability scanning, penetration testing, training and awareness. I mean, the list goes on and on here. So fantastic content. Um, at the end of all of this, it seems to me like the greatest risk that exists is actually the risk of inaction and the risk of not engaging in this in any way, shape, or form. And so while there are certainly risks with action, and we went through a lot of them here, there are ways to mitigate that. And it seems like in the world that we're operating in, right, if data really is the currency of the future, that the greatest risk is inaction. And so really that feels to me like that's the message, right, from all of your commentary here, that it's time to get rolling because this is a huge opportunity. But also, if you don't get moving down this path, you might get left behind and be at a competitive disadvantage.
Yeah, totally agree. You're right. It's that fine line that we have to walk, but it's worth, it's worth doing that. It's worth the effort and to make sure data is secure because of the value that it can provide us, how it can help us better serve our customers. And but you're right. A lot to think about and a lot to put in place to make sure that data is secure.
Well, thank you, Jeff. We appreciate all of your thoughts, your experience, your insights here. This has been a great conversation, and we hope to have you back to talk more about this in the future. I think this is going to be a huge topic in 2025, and look forward to continuing to follow it with you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. It was great to be here. Thank you.